Hey guys, what's up, and welcome to Wood Bronze or Bronze Masters, whatever you want to call it. My name is filtersc, and I'm going to kind of step you through how to play Starcraft 2 from a really basic level. We're going to talk about all the different races, we're going to talk about hotkeys, how to set your game up, all that fun stuff. It really doesn't matter if you're a low-level Starcraft player jumping in and trying to figure things out and all that stuff. If you're starting here, or if you're somebody who's brand new to the game, I'm going to be able to walk you through everything. In case you're wondering who I am, I've been playing Starcraft 2 for a number of years myself. Started way back when the game came out in Wings of Liberty. I've basically been playing non-stop all the way through, with the exception of a couple breaks here and there. I'm not the best player in the world, but I'm in the top 1 or 2%, which, relative to how good players are, isn't actually that good. But I know my way around the game. The ultimate goal here is just to get you guys to a point where you're able to play the game and just enjoy it, enjoy the content that's out there, enjoy watching pro games and stealing their builds and all that fun stuff. That's the goal, that's the point of my material, that's the point of the Bronze Masters series. So if you got redirected by one of the Bronze Masters episodes over to this side and you feel like it's worthwhile to kind of jump through and run through everything because you're brand new to the game, or if this is where you're starting off, we're going to talk about everything and kind of get you going. And let's get started, boys. Alright, so the first thing is, in the background, you're going to see a bunch of games, and these are just games that I've played and recorded to kind of show off a little bit so you can kind of see what the game looks like when it's played at least a reasonable level, right? And the first thing I want to really address here is StarCraft 2 has this reputation that the game is extremely hard and that it's incredibly difficult to even get started with. And while that's true for the 1v1 environment, that's not necessarily the case for the game as a whole. There's lots of things you can do to start enjoying the game, right? If you're playing team games with your friends, if you're playing Archon mode and Legacy of the Void, even though this is mainly focused on Heart of the Swarm series because Legacy is going to go through a lot of changes, there's a lot of things where you can learn to play the game and improve and enjoy the game kind of as is. The big thing though is there is kind of a skill floor, and that is, where you have to have very basic macro orientated skills. And what macro is your ability to go through and just build things, right? It's your ability to spend money, build units, give yourself the units to go out and fight, right? If you're coming from a League of Legends or Counter-Strike background or just any games in general, this is the part where StarCraft 2 is a little bit different. Because any of those games you can kind of play and you can go kill somebody, you can kill somebody else, and you just start enjoying the game right away. If the other guys are as bad as you are, it's not going to make that much of a difference, right? But what happens in StarCraft 2 is without that fundamental base of basic macro, it doesn't matter if both players are really bad. What ends up happening is a lot of situations that are actually not unfair start to feel unfair. A lot of units that are really popular in low leagues start to feel really unfair and kind of not that fun to play against because you're just not used to getting to that floor with your basic macros. So that's where the difficulty of the game comes in. The fact that the game really doesn't start to open up into the more strategic options, right? Because it is a strategy game, but you have to be able to get to that kind of basic macro floor to get the most out of the game and enjoy it. And that's what we're going to be talking about through this series, is just getting you to a very, very basic macro floor so that you can go on to enjoy the rest of the game and really what it has to offer. But that's where the massive difficulty reputation comes from. And in all honesty, it's not that hard to kind of get through that early game and get through that basic understanding and basic macro and all that stuff, as long as you focus on the right areas and you're making sure you're attempting to get that basic skill set built up before you really start thinking about stuff like what are your strategic options, what is my opponent even doing. All that kind of stuff is pretty much irrelevant compared to getting your basic macro going, because if somebody is not very good and you're playing against them, what they're doing is going to be very difficult to read into, right? So if you can just get to the basic macro floor, you're going to be able to beat almost everybody, especially early on. And then once you start jumping up, then you can start getting into the more advanced stuff and the more advanced strategy, right? And that's what we're going to focus on. That's what we're really going to look on. And that's basically the point of the whole series here, guys. The other thing I wanted to mention within this section is you need to forget the term build order. I will mention it from time to time, and I am going to talk about some very basic build orders. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to go to a website and just look up, hey, this is the best build order right now currently, because you won't understand why the build order is so good and all the different concepts that go into making it a really good build order, let alone be able to execute this. And this is going to sound a little bit crazy, but The more difficult builds in Starcraft 2 are builds that I don't time properly, right? And I'm in the top 1 or 2% of the world, and my timings will be, a minute or 2 minutes late. And in the world of Starcraft 2, that's a very, very long time. What that means is if I played against one of the best players in the world, I would lose 100% of the time because their timings and their macro and all that stuff in their micro even would be so crisp compared to mine, I just wouldn't stand a chance. So when you're talking about build orders and you go and you look something up and you read it and you're like, okay, I need to do this and this and this, but you don't necessarily understand what makes that build order so good or so strong, or even what it's weak against, you're going to have a really hard time. So when I do talk about build orders and do show some very basic build orders, understand the point of it is not the build order itself, because most of the time the build orders won't be super amazing high level, but they will be designed to give you that mechanical ground floor, so that you can continue to play the game and you can continue to get better and improve and start to understand the game a little bit better. So again, we're not focusing on build orders. I need to make this point crystal clear because in the past I've had that problem where people are like, oh man, what build are you doing for this video, or what build are you doing? And the build order is not the important part. The build order is not what makes this kind of material strong. So you have to keep that in mind, guys, or you're going to have a really hard time going forward in the future. The other tool you can use to really improve fast is to play customs, team games, and then when you do that, just practice the right things so you can get there quickly and kind of start to hit that very basic macro point, rather than just straight up dumping onto the one-on-one ladder. So that's going to be one of the first things, is just play a few custom games, get a feel for each race. If you already have a race in mind that you want to play, that's cool too. And don't be afraid to jump into team games too. You play 2v2s, 3v3s, 4v4s. You got somebody else on your team that has your back. For the most part, the StarCraft community is pretty accepting of people. And don't worry too much if you lose quite often at the start, because eventually you're going to start to play with and against people that are around your skill level. It's not uncommon in StarCraft 2 to lose, like if you're brand new to the game, to lose like 20 or 30 games in a row just because of the way the placement system works, unfortunately. So don't be afraid of that. Don't worry too much. Don't be afraid of jumping right on in there. Alright, we're going to jump into what StarCraft 2 really is at its core really quickly here. And then we're going to talk about the races a little bit. And then finally we're going to talk about what we're going to do in the next episode. But for right now, let's just mention this and get it out of the way really early. Don't come into this game with a winning mentality. Don't expect to win every game you play. You can want to win as much as possible, but you really have to be looking for personal improvement to get the most out of the game of StarCraft 2. Because at the end of the day, you're going to win half your games, you're going to lose half your games. Unless you're at the tip-top tier, where you're going to be able to beat like 70-80% of the people on ladder, and you're, top 20 in your region or whatever, you're really looking at like a 50-50 win ratio. It's not going to get any better than that, and that's the same for like pretty much every game out there. So if you want to get the most out of it, and you want to have a fulfilling experience in StarCraft 2, make sure you look for personal improvement. Be ready to lose games when you're learning new things. I do it all the time. I'm more than okay with losing a whole bunch of games because I really don't care that much. What I want to do is learn and get better and improve. And this doesn't mean, go play unranked and all that stuff. This means like even on your main account, it's okay if you're learning new stuff to practice it out and figure it out a little bit, in ranked play on your main account. It really isn't that big of a deal if you lose a few games because you made some mistakes while you're trying something new. Tons of players get just caught and hung up on this, and they end up capping themselves. So what do I mean when I say that? Well, I'll play players all the time that, they'll do this really cheesy all-in bust or something, or they'll do some really cheesy build, and then I'll hit them immediately again right after, and they'll do the same build because that's all they can do. They can't do anything else, and this, I might lose the first game, but the second game I'll just crush them, and the game won't even be close. They won't have the skill set to go into a longer-term game. It just won't be there. So when you do stuff like that and you kind of get addicted to some of these like really, free win strategies, even though they don't exist in this game. But if you start to really get addicted to a certain part of the game and you find yourself, not using siege tanks as a Terran player in TVT because you just don't like them, you really need to be ready to lose games and learn new things. Don't get caught up on just winning and just playing your best for this one game, because you're going to find your improvement will come a lot faster if you're more than okay with not getting hung up on that stuff and just working on personal improvement. And you know what? I get some really fast, cheesy games. Sometimes people just all in, and you get like 3 or 4 of them in a row. That does get frustrating to play against. But at the same time, I'm able to push through it and continue to improve, continue to get better. And that's how I got to Masters in the first place. It wasn't by doing a lot of these cheesy builds, right? That's how I was able to sustain my gameplay. So it's really important you remember that when you're practicing, when you're playing games. Don't get addicted to things. I'm going to show you some builds early on that are really, really super easy to execute, and you can win a lot of games with them. But if you continue to do that, and that's all you do, and you get carried to a division you really don't belong in because you don't have what's backing you up, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble, right? Good examples on Counter-Strike would be if all you do is like rush, all you do is play Dust 2 and then like rush tunnels with a P90 or something, and you cannot use a rifle and you cannot use an op or whatever to save your damn life. You're going to have a really hard time ranking up at a certain point once your opponents kind of start to declass you and take you apart, right? And if you play, a group of smart players, you play the same people in a row, they're just going to shut that down. The same thing applies in Starcraft 2. And it's not even all that different than a game like League of Legends. If all you do is play one champion or hero in one spot, and you cannot do anything else because you haven't learned how to play all the different roles and strategies in games like League and Dota 2, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. You're going to hit a point where, you might be able to continue to play that character at a high level, but as soon as you get pushed out of that role, you're going to be dead weight to your team. And the same thing applies with StarCraft 2. You can get absolutely addicted to a brand new hot build that's amazing. Then it gets figured out, or maybe a patch comes and the meta changes, and then you're in all kinds of trouble. And you don't want to put yourself in that spot. So, it's cool to want to win, and you want to try to win every game you possibly can, but really focus on personal improvement. And don't worry too much about winning every single game. Try to focus on the things that you want to get better at and the things that you did well. And don't be afraid to write off a few of those games that you lose because your opponent did something a little bit goofy, a little bit cheesy, a little bit off the wall. Doesn't really matter. So with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about what StarCraft 2 is, if you don't already know. StarCraft 2 is obviously a real-time strategy game. It's economically focused, which means your macro, your economy, your workers, all that stuff is much more important than basically everything else in the game. That's the backbone of the game. If you're not capable of doing that part, you're going to have a really hard time with the other aspects of the game. Even the best players in the world that really have a heavy micro focus will have almost immaculate macro, and it's really, really important to be able to handle the macro side of things first, get that up to snuff, and then you can start learning all the cool micro and all the other cool tricks that you can do in the game. But first, you got to start with the economy. That's the backbone of StarCraft 2. So if you're coming to StarCraft 2 because you love coming up with unique and awesome strategies and stuff like that, just remember that stuff's not going to work unless you put the time in to make sure mechanically you're capable of playing the game at a good level. The other thing about it is StarCraft 2 has two very obvious resources. It's got minerals and gas. Your minerals are typically used for production and some of the cheaper low-tech units. Gas is used for higher-tech units. It's used in upgrades and all that kind of stuff. And that's what kind of gates your ability to do certain things. Remember, though, StarCraft 2 is not a tier-focused game. Unlike some other games you're going to find, like Planetary Annihilation or Total Annihilation way back in the day, getting to the highest tier tech tree is not how you win games in StarCraft 2. You don't want to just simply rush for those tier 3 units because a lot of the tier 1 and tier 2 units are really, really, really good, especially when you start talking about Terran. But even then, a lot of the focus is on those smaller units and how they develop and get better through upgrades throughout the game and stay relevant. There's never a case where a unit can come out that can just kill everything under the sun that's tier 1. So you have to remember that when we get into this. The next part is vision and knowledge is also a resource in StarCraft 2. The more vision you have on the map, the easier it is to spot your opponent's next move and counter it. There's watchtowers on the map near the middle in a lot of cases where you can go grab those. You can usually put a few units out and off to the sides to catch drops coming in and all that kind of stuff. So if you have vision of certain things happening and your ass is staring at the minimap, you're going to find you're going to have a lot more success. This is going to start to be more and more important as you start to rank up and get better at the game. But just remember, vision and knowledge is every bit as important as a resource compared to minerals and gas. It's really important that you have both the vision of what's going on in the game so you can make the correct decision, as well as the knowledge of what to do. Now, knowledge is the most difficult part about StarCraft 2 to build up. It'll take a very long time before you have enough knowledge about your own race's capabilities, your own build order's capabilities, your opponent's build, and what his race can do, before you really get to a point where you're going to feel comfortable. Even in a situation like myself, I feel like my knowledge is something that really does hold me back, and I need to work on it non-stop, because quite often I'll make the wrong decision purely based on that knowledge, right? And it takes forever to build up. So just remember, vision and knowledge, also a resource. And then the final resource, and this is what a lot of people are going to struggle with, is APM. And what is APM? APM is actions per minute. That's how fast you can press buttons on your keyboard. That's how fast you can use your mouse to do certain tasks. A lot of players, when they first start off playing Starcraft 2, are going to be playing at 20 or 30 APM. And the reason for that is your brain is just not able to process the information it's getting very fast. You have to think about everything you do, and it takes a very long time to build that APM up. You're going to get a lot faster once your body starts just being able to do things on its own. It's just like typing, if you want to use an example from the real world. If you ever see somebody who's a really good typist, they don't have to look at the keys. They don't have to think of how to type out a certain word. Their hands and their body will just type the word. Those are the guys that have blazing fast words per minute when you start talking about keyboard play, people typing on a keyboard. The guys that have to hunt and peck and look for keys and think about every keystroke, those guys take forever to type anything out. So just remember, APM is not something you build because you're physically fast. APM is something that comes with both knowledge of the game, so you know what you want to do automatically, and then building up the mechanical just muscle memory, basically, to be able to execute those actions without having to think about them, without having to look at the keyboard, without having to think about what the controls are, without having to look at the hotkey in the bottom right. APM builds up over time, guys. It is a resource, and the reason I say it's a resource is because there's only so many things you can do at once. If you're trying to fight on 2 different fronts or 3 different fronts and build stuff at home and throw down structures, unless you're a super high-level Korean, you're going to have a really hard time doing that. So, with that in mind, you have to think of your APM basically as a resource. Where am I going to spend my APM? Should I be spending it on building more stuff at home, or should I be spending it microing this fight? And it's going to be up for you to decide as you get better at the game. But remember, those are your main resources: minerals and gas, vision and knowledge, and APM, and that is what StarCraft 2 is all focused on, boys. Alright, the final part of this first episode, and I know it's kind of a long one, guys, so thanks for sticking through. Hopefully you've enjoyed what we've talked about so far. The final 3 things we're going to talk about are the different races, and I highly recommend and encourage everybody to try all the races. You have nothing to lose by learning how to play even on a basic level Terran, Zerg, and Protoss, and again, I'm going to show you different things you can do to start to get better at all 3 races, but try them all, find out what kind of suits your needs and suits how you want to play, because the game does play very differently depending on which race you pick. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses, they're all better or worse at certain aspects of the game. No one race is really overpowered, although a lot of people will talk about it. I think right now the win rates are like 48 to 49% in all of the matchups in the game. So there's really no overpowered or extra strong race. There's no race that can just get to a free win condition. You'll hear a lot of bitching about Protoss. You'll hear a lot of people complain about Terran. You're going to hear a lot of people complain about Zerg in all aspects of the game. The bottom line is they're all strong in their own right. And you don't want to pick a race because it's OP, and you don't want to pick a race because it's easier for a new player. You're going to hear that about Protoss a lot. Protoss is easier as a new player. Well, actually, Protoss is probably the most difficult race to truly understand all the inner workings of, whereas Terran is kind of the opposite. Terran is incredibly difficult to get to the actual skill cap of, but learning how to use everything and what you should be using all the things for is much easier, right? Although the skill cap for what you can do with Terran units is incredibly high. So there's different aspects to each race, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit here. The first one is Terran. Terran's the race I usually play. Terran's my main race, although I can play both of the other races at a fairly decent level as well. So obviously I have a little bit of bias towards Terran. Maybe you should all pick Terran. No, I'm just kidding. It really doesn't matter what race you pick. But with Terran, the biggest things to remember about them is they have a lot of really good harassment units. So they're really good at kind of picking off workers from their opponent. They're really good at taking advantage of an opponent that's not paying attention. They rely heavily on mid-game based aggression, so if you want to fight a ton in the middle of the game, Terran's the race for you. The other thing about Terran, though, is they do have fairly complex builds that involve swapping over add-ons from different production structures, as well as they have low health units. Their units are generally not very durable, so if you make a mistake when you're controlling your units, maybe you move command them, don't laugh, it happens even at the highest level, your units are not going to be very effective, right? Because they will just die very quickly, they won't get their damage off, they won't be what they're supposed to be for. And then the other part about Terran is, as I talked about before, they have that very, very high skill cap, which means a really stupidly good high-level Terran player can do crazy things that people didn't even think was possible with their most basic units. So keep that in mind. If you want to have a race that lets you micro to your heart's absolutely content, that's where Terran excels. However, if you don't have that macro backbone, Terran is not going to work out very well for you. The next race we're going to talk about is Zerg. Now, a lot of people will tell you that Zerg has, just you have to be so on point with your macro. You have to inject all the time and stuff like that. Legacy of the Void, that's going to change. But for right now, Zerg leans very heavily on that. If you want to be a pure mechanical player and just, beat your opponents because you can make way more stuff than they could ever imagine possible, Zerg excels at that. The other thing that Zerg really needs to be able to do is scout their opponent's composition properly and figure out what units they need to make and when they need to make them. Because Zerg uses their resources a little bit differently, Zerg is not able to make both workers and units at the same time, right? So what that means is you need to know when an attack's coming, where it's coming from, far in advance so that you can prepare the correct defense for it. Because if you just make a bunch of units to stay safe as a Zerg player, you're going to lose way more often if your opponent just doesn't attack you, right? Because you're not getting the economy up that Zerg really needs to be powerful. So you got to be able to scout, you got to be able to do all that stuff if you want to be a successful Zerg player. The other thing about Zerg is their micro opportunities are a little bit more limited than the other races. There are things like early game ZVZ, there's a lot of crazy stuff you're going to see, but overall their micro is very limited in terms of what you're going to see compared to, say, a Terran player or even a Protoss player in terms of what their opportunities are for that super, super awesome micro. It's not there, but their multitasking does have to be very strong. You do, like I said, lean very, very heavily on your macro. There are Zergs out there that just produce so much stuff, it's unbelievable. Even on the professional level, there's guys that differentiate themselves by just having godlike macro. And that's not to say there is no micro, because there definitely is a lot that you can do as a Zerg player to make your units more effective. It's just that the macro side is so much stronger. The last part about Zerg is Zerg feels horrible to lose as. If you're playing Zerg, the way you die as a Zerg player is god-awful. It basically means you really don't have any units. You're desperately trying to produce them, but you're just banking money because you don't have any larva, because you missed injects or whatever. And it just feels like garbage to lose a Zerg because you're going to feel really helpless as you start to die compared to the other races where Protoss and Terran can scrap it a little bit more. Terran definitely can scrap beyond belief even after taking massive amounts of damage. Zerg doesn't really have that ability. Zerg, it just feels really crappy when you lose them, so keep that in mind. It's kind of a weird thing to say when we're talking about the races, but just how it is for Zerg. The next one is Protoss, and Protoss is by far the weirdest race when you start talking about how the game plays. The way Protoss works is you're leading on really crisp timings. What that means is having the concept of your build order really well planned out in terms of where everything goes, even your buildings and all that stuff, and relying on basically the bare minimum in terms of defense and units so you can get up your tech and really do a lot of damage to your opponent, really make it hard. A Protoss player that can defend like a god is one of the most frustrating things for anybody to play against. So keep that in mind. If you want to play Protoss, you're really leaning on those timings. The other part about Protoss is you can die early on really easily. You could have 25 Marines just show up at your front door and kill you. You can die to a Ling run by because you didn't have something defending where it was supposed to be. You can die to all sorts of all-ins and garbage because you just weren't quite ready, or you weren't watching the minimap when the Terran flew in with a dropship or something like that. So Protoss can die really easily in the early game. It really does take a lot of skill in those early fights in terms of their micro and all that stuff to be able to get those power units out on the field and really make something happen in the mid game. The other part is you're leaning again on those big power units. Protoss has a lot of really big, heavy-hitting units that, well, they're fantastic, and that's where their, the whole A-move Protoss thing comes from, because they have these monster units that hit like trucks. If those units are left undefended and don't have very much around them, so let's say you haven't managed to warp in a lot of your, your zealots, your stalkers, your kind of buffer units for those big boys, those units can die really, really easily, and you can just lose the game because you were slightly out of position. The other thing, too, is their big power units, like the Colossus, like to walk over cliffs on their own, derp around. It's really easy to just watch your Colossus die. Even at the highest level of Starcraft 2 in the professional scene right now, a lot of Terran players are focusing on getting the Protoss out of position to take those units out. So it's not easy to keep your power units alive. You lean very, very heavily on those units. But Protoss does have a lot of room to be a little tricky little bastard. So if you're interested in deceiving your opponent, if you're interested in doing some really cool stuff to just throw your opponent for a loop and just chuck them completely off their game, Protoss is the race for you. They have the best ability to do just something completely wonky and a little bit weird at an off-kilter timing that will just end the game. They're the best race for that. They have the most all-ins by far against anybody. And if that's the playstyle you want to do, Protoss is definitely the race for you. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that side of things because that's not how I play them, but they definitely have that ability to just throw a gigantic wrench into their opponent's wheels, like a bicycle, and just make them look silly. So remember, Protoss can do that. The last thing, and this is kind of what I mentioned in the opener about Protoss, is they're the most difficult race to truly understand. You have to understand so much about your timings, about your build order, about when to make probes, when to stop making probes, when to make units, when to stop making units, when to throw down more gateways. All that stuff is actually a really hard concept to try to get used to. Protoss players quite often get, kind of hammed for being quote-unquote the easy race. And getting to that level of understanding where you can make all the correct decisions with Protoss is extremely difficult. The reason they get kind of canned for being the quote-unquote easy race is purely because what happens, and this does tend to happen, and you need to really watch yourself if you're going to pick Protoss. A lot of players will just learn like one build, or they'll learn one style with Protoss, and they'll do things where they lose like 25, 30, 40% of the time if their opponent just makes the correct decision, but they win 50 to 60% of the time if their opponent is not able to punish what they're trying to do. That doesn't mean cheesing, that can even mean in macro games. I'll quite often play players that go for really greedy styles and just kill them outright. And these are players that I'm playing at my level, and they're just going for something that's way too greedy that if it gets punished, they're gonna lose, right? But then you have the other guys that I'll play that just, they scout me out, they're flying stuff over my base just to make sure they know what I'm doing at all times. They'll never let me get a drop in. They'll play extremely well, and I'll beat them because they played the game quote-unquote correctly, right? And then sometimes I'll lose to the guy that just gets really greedy because I'll miss my timing. I won't punish what they're doing, right? Or I'll lose to like some cheesy all-in or whatever. So you have to really remember that with Protoss. It's really, really hard to be a Protoss player that plays the game, and I say quote-unquote the correct way because everybody can play the game in their own way. But that is one of the hardest things to be, is a Protoss player that makes scouts correctly, makes the correct decisions, adjusts his build where he needs to adjust it, doesn't play overly greedy, and just kind of takes it slow, makes all the correct steps to ensure they're going to take home a victory, right? And you can even see this on the highest level in the professional game, where there's some tricky bastards out there, and then there's some more solid Protoss, and funnily enough, the ratio of guys that win is about 50-50, so it is what it is, guys. If you're going to play Protoss, you're going to have to decide how you want to play them, because they have a bunch of different ways to play. And that's basically all I have to say on the 3 different races. Pick what suits your style, play something you enjoy. Don't let other people get to you in terms of what they might say. Make up your own mind, play them all, figure out which one you feel kind of best suits you. And don't be afraid to swap if down the road you feel like you might want to try something new. It's all good. It doesn't matter. It's actually a good thing to have an understanding of all 3 races. For somebody like me who can play them all at a decent level, it makes it a hell of a lot easier for me to figure out what is hard to deal with for my opponent versus somebody who doesn't play that race and just thinks it's overpowered and complains, right? So with that being said, guys, the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to set up your game so you get the best amount of information in front of you, and how to set up your hotkeys so you can ignore a few different things, because hotkeys are one of the most hotly contested topics in the Starcraft 2 kind of universe. A lot of people really think you can do everything with them, and then there's some people that just flat out don't even use them. So you need to be using a few of them. That's what we're going to talk about in the next video. We're going to show you how to set all that up so you're going to be good to go when you get onto the game and you start playing it. My name is filtersc. I'm sorry this video has been kind of long, but I wanted to cover a whole bunch of different stuff for you, and hopefully you enjoyed the stuff in the background. I will see you guys next time. Make sure you like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, do all that fun stuff. You can find more content on my channel for StarCraft 2, and I will see you guys in the next video.